Well, joining me now is Henry Newman. He's director of Open Europe. That's a think tank that calls for reform of the EU. And Jonathan Portes, who's Professor of Economics at King's College London. Henry, let's just start with this crisp analogy. Factually, where do we stand if we keep a customs union and trade with the rest of the world? Is it ruled out immediately?
Well, what the customs union would mean was that the EU could broadly sell access to our markets without our control. So it would keep some things easier, but it would essentially be paying the price of keeping things easier and minimising the costs of Brexit, but giving up on the long-term possibilities and the long-term flexibility. Now, my think tank, Open Europe, has been arguing that we need to accept the costs of Brexit, accept that this was fundamentally a political decision rather than an economic decision, that we should leave the customs union, maybe we should delay that exit. And
we need to bring the economics into this, because that is what people need. They want facts. They want to know, well, if we pull out of a customs union with the EU, which is, everybody agrees at the moment, our biggest trading partner, is the potential in the rest of the world that we could actually
Well, it's
do
not an
much
either-or choice, and the problem with this is, as in many areas, the facts are disputed. But I think, yes, there will be a cost of us leaving, but leaving the customs union doesn't mean that we can't trade with the EU. And of course, there are no countries outside of the EU, no significant country, that's in the customs union. We could have a partial customs union, which Turkey does, which covers only goods. But that still creates significant barriers to trade. If you try and cross the border between Turkey and the EU, there are substantial tailbacks. So leaving the EU is going to have costs. We discussed all of this at huge length during the referendum campaign. And I think it's really depressing that we're still discussing all of this 2 years on, rather than getting on with the actual job of working out what we're trying to do afterwards.
Jonathan, the problem is a lot of people are revisiting that referendum campaign on a daily basis because we didn't necessarily have the facts then. Have we got them now?
Well, I think we know rather more about the economics of leaving the EU than we did, although there's still lots of uncertainties. But I think the key thing in terms of the costs and benefits, Henry's absolutely right. If we were outside the customs union, we would certainly have more flexibility, and that would make it easier for us to do our own trade deals with other countries. We wouldn't have to tag on within the EU, and there would be costs and benefits for that. Equally, there are costs and benefits of leaving the customs union, which will make trade with the rest of Europe harder. It won't end trade with Europe. Other countries trade with Europe from outside. It will make it harder. But I think the key thing in terms of numbers is that we know, and of course Liam Fox knows this because it's his own economist, the Treasury economist who's done this, that the cost of leaving the single market and the customs union together, estimated at between, depending on what happens, between 2, 3, 4 and 8% of GDP. Those costs are likely to very substantially outweigh any gains from new trade deals with the US and China.
In the short or the long term?
In the long run. So that I think, the government's economists are saying that, and all serious independent economists who've looked at this have also come to the same conclusion.
There are loads of policy decisions that the government takes that are not necessarily in the best economic interest of the country. We could choose to build all over the green belt in this country and build houses absolutely everywhere. We could choose to have a completely open-door immigration policy, but we don't, because we decide that those are political decisions that are more important to us than a simple economic calculation. Now, I think it's obviously the case that there will be a cost to Brexit. I've said that from the beginning. But it's also the case that there is untapped global potential. So I was surprised to hear Martin Donnelly saying that this morning.
It's words like untapped that skews this argument. Because Liam Fox this morning was going into, well, we can make this from this part of the world, from Japan, from the United States. But we won't know until we start negotiating. We can't start negotiating until we leave the EU. We're in a complete catch-22. We just don't know.
Sure. I mean, none of us have a crystal ball. So, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that I know all the future. But it's true that we have some more insight into what's happening post-Brexit in economic terms. But I actually think that what we've seen is that the economic effects of the referendum have been far less than were predicted by many people prior to the referendum, including by the Treasury's own predictions inside government. They predicted a very significant downturn. Actually, we've seen growth continuing. We've seen unemployment continuing to fall, employment continuing to rise, productivity gains as well. What we are is possibly growing less than we were predicted to grow, but we're still growing. So I think it's quite hard to be very definitive about the possibilities here.
Jonathan, you can grow on the basis of having a three-course meal or a packet of crisps. Both are growing. And the worry is, with that analogy, people are going to be concerned that we are throwing out the baby with the bathwater if this customs union is a no-go for this.
Well, I think that's right. But I think it's also important to say that the big economic downsides come from leaving the customs union and leaving the single market. And of course, neither Liam Fox nor Jeremy Corbyn said anything very definitive about the single market. yesterday. So that's not just what happens at borders, but conforming to the same regulations and standards that the rest of Europe does. And I think, I agree with Henry. There are political choices here. There are economic choices here. There is almost certainly some negative economic impact of leaving the single market and customs union, but there are also political considerations as well.
And those political choices were taken in the referendum in 2016. I watched the television debates. I listened to the principals on both sides, David Cameron, George Osborne, Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, all saying that a vote to leave would entail leaving the single market, and saying in terms that we'd also be out of the customs union, because they were talking about the possibilities of free trade deals. Now, we can spend the next 5 years discussing this over and over again in TV studios, and I'm very happy to come on and debate this with Jonathan and you. But I don't think that's a productive way for us to go forward. We've taken a decision to leave the EU. The question is, what do we do with those freedoms once we've left it? Where should we look around the world? And of course, nobody's saying we should stop trading with Europe. We need to do whatever we can to minimise barriers to trade. We shouldn't be putting up tariffs.
So park the EU, deal with that separately, but in terms of the rest of the world... Yeah. Is there that vast untapped
market? We did some analysis on this, and we looked at there's various different ways of cutting the data, and we looked at if you take a gravity model, which looks at the idea that you should be trading more with countries closest to you and more with countries that share certain legal traditions, historical traditions, language, and so on. And we found that we are very substantially under-trading with some countries, like Canada, like India, like Israel, and China in the case of services. Now, we could dispute about the actual numbers that we found, but we're talking about billions of pounds of potential untapped trade. Now, this isn't a zero-sum game. We can trade very well with the EU. We may have to accept some costs around leaving the customs union, some impact perhaps on financial services, but ultimately we can build our trade with the rest of the world, but also protect some of our trade with the EU.
I agree with Henry that there clearly is untapped potential to trade with countries outside the EU, and that most of the growth in UK trade in the future will come from those countries. It's not clear that free trade deals, or the ability to do free trade deals independently, have very much to do with that, frankly. Yeah. I mean, Germany does far better than we do, and it doesn't seem to be held back by being part of the EU at all. It's the most successful exporter in the world, including to places like China and India. So the idea, I think,
how does that work?
Well, I mean, because Germany makes good products that people in China and India and other countries.
So money talks.
Well, no. Being a productive, having a productive, efficient, competitive economy works. Now, will we find it easier to do that outside of the EU? In some respects, maybe. In others, perhaps not. But the idea that being outside the EU and being able to make our own free trade deals will suddenly rectify this export underperformance that we've seen, I think that's frankly pie in the sky.
That's absolutely true. But we should be taking the opportunities of Brexit, addressing those problems of productivity, and getting on with the future.
Well, we will be talking about this again. I'm sorry, Henry, but I think we will. Henry Newman, Jonathan Portes, thank you both very much for coming in. Thank you.
Thank you.